Well, thanks very much, Christine. Oh, just need to learn to work all this stuff again. Good afternoon. Very close to 50 years ago, I found myself appointed Professor of Marketing at the University of New South Wales. I was a little surprised because I was an economist, an econometrician, in fact. I'd been lecturing for about 10 years at that point, and I wondered a little bit how I got to be where I was. Turned out that I'd come back from Purdue University, where I was an associate professor for a while with Frank Bass and others that turned out to be leading lights in marketing. And so back in Sydney, a new chair of marketing was founded by business, and I got to get the chair, much to my surprise. Having done so, I wondered just what marketing was. Surprisingly, I suppose, since I had not studied the field of marketing, I was trying to invent it as we go, as it were. And I still am not quite sure what marketing is or could be. And so this is partly a record of the journey that I've made over the years. In part because I began to think about just what I should be teaching as I began to travel a little. I experienced an Australian aid project for a number of months in central Java, and that was interesting. I began to think about what this remote town of Cilacap actually was going to be like. A proposed industrial estate was to be built there. What impact would that have on all the people, on the small businesses, on the one or two large businesses, on just life? Then as one travels, and in Australia that's what you do, because as soon as you move outside the country, you have to travel. I found myself in India and with my wife Marilyn in many different parts of the world. And so the first thing, I better step over here a bit, hadn't I? The first kind of thing I experienced this was just recent, but I began to think about marketing in many different ways. It wasn't just advanced, contemporary, Western society that was involved. It was all sorts of people like this in Cusco, in a street market there. What do you say to those people? How does marketing interact with those sorts of activities? Or this was Cilacap, where I was in 1974. That was the marketplace that I knew. It wasn't simply an advanced Western market at all. It was just a quite different kind of marketplace. But somehow or other, as I began to look at all these, it seemed to me there were regularities. There were patterns to be found in these sorts of markets. Here's one in Tibet. A somewhat more sophisticated market. These are butter churns in a Chokang, just in front of the major temple in Lhasa. The guy in the back there with the tallish man with the white shirt. He was the one that was in charge of the stall. But you can see behind them all different sorts of stalls. So what sort of regularity might there be in these? It seemed to me there were locational patterns, people who were selling different things, vegetables clustered together, fish clustered together, clothes clustered together. So there were locational factors that began to be present. There were present things that, in terms of the display mechanisms, what you did in order to catch attention, how you interacted with the customers, what kind of things you did in order to bargain with them, Did marketing actually occur? These were all the sorts of things that I began to sense were emergent properties of the way that markets actually worked. Particularly, it got bigger. This was Canto in a floating market in the Mekong River in Vietnam. Just totally congested area, maybe several hundred metres by several hundred metres, just boats everywhere, interacting with each other, bargaining with each other. As you can see, they're busy trading all the time. Then you go to something a little further, in Kunming in China. This was the first one of the early Walmart stores. And it changed the pattern of retailing. In fact, there were, not easily seen, but there were also stalls outside that. But Walmart has taken root in China, and it's, as indeed has contemporary retailing. Then you look at the Aalsmeer flower markets, a totally different context altogether. And let's take another one, the Tsukiji fish markets in Tokyo. They're trying to knock all those down now to redevelop in terms of hotels and things, but there's a lot of resistance to that. But this was where fresh fish came into the Tokyo environment, and it was dispensed with hundreds and hundreds of tons of fish each day. These were all examples of markets and marketing at work. And as I struggled with this over the years, it seemed to me that we had somehow to create a theory of marketing, an understanding of marketing that would embrace all of these different kinds of contexts. Marketing was not just something that happened in advanced Western communities, it was something that was a universal. And that's where I began to get a sense that marketing was an innate human characteristic. It's just one of those things that in every human community you find beginning to take place as people exchanged, bartered, did things with each other in order to gain both satisfaction in themselves, but also people would engage in trade partly just to talk to each other. It was a mutuality, a flow of information, of ideas, of action. You see it in coffee shops in the marketplace. This sort of thing happens regularly. And so too also was a degree of altruism. All of these things blended into and should be part of our understanding of exchange as a foundation for marketing itself. So this is where I began. A little while later, quite a long while later in fact, this latest issue of the Journal of Macro Marketing, the editor decided to reproduce this particular picture. And it was kind of interesting in the sense that much of what I'd just been talking about, exchange, trade and barter, was up in this corner, was autarky. It was random type exchange patterns. Sometimes these began to form stronger patterns here and they became emergent. Later, they would become more structured, and there was quite a strong sense of structure beginning and pattern beginning to develop. And finally, the large corporations of the world were seen as purposeful. I looked at these things in terms of micro, meso, and macro views. This is individuals or individual entities or actors within a marketing system. These were meso-level operations, groups that formed, patterns that formed, and finally there was the macro level itself, which could be a whole country, a community, a region. But as you looked at it, where we started there, that was where much of those early pictures that I showed to you a minute ago were exchange, and barter and trade. What happened then? All these things began to develop away from that. Trade routes, the notorious Silk Roads, all began to form. Crowds and audiences built up, and as they built up, they interacted with each other and began to form ideas collectively. You found farmers' markets. Occasionally there were intermediaries, facilitators. In the Javanese marketplace, the farmers who grew rice the rice would be collected by a peddler who would then locate a wholesaler that would then supply a marketplace. So these sorts of things all grew up. Salala was second-hand clothing. As people began to discard clothing, they would open up markets there. Franchise systems, social marketing. But then the classical marketing, conventional marketing, was all located down here, with only a little bit of what seemed to me to be a wide-ranging structure or field of marketing that one really ought to be studying. Business ecosystems, the emergence of platforms, commodity marketing systems, malls, shopping malls, retailing, informal markets, business networks, centrally planned studies. The Russian communist or early Chinese marketplaces were all there. The economists studied this bit, which was not particularly relevant to almost anything else. And so, as I looked at all that, you could see different structures beginning to emerge. Autarky was where we began, where everything was, people were arguing, debating, working with each other. These patterns began to emerge. Retailer groups, marketplaces would form. For example, might be an intersection of a road. It could be a town marketplace in front of shops or whatever, or part of public buildings. Emergent marketplaces would form. Sometimes these would be dominated by one or two very purposeful firms. Often it would simply be structured. A lot of independent entities grouped together in a marketplace itself. And each of these could change. It would be possible for an emergent structure to descend into anarchy. It would be possible for an emergent structure to become either purposeful or structured. Nothing was stable. And that seems to me to be one of the key dimensions of marketplaces today and marketing systems, that nothing is stable. It's all of it dynamic. And that becomes important for the reasons that marketing as a conventional marketing, we start to think in terms of planning. We believe we can change something. It might be a new marketing plan, a new marketing structure, and it finishes up with a different outcome, which is what we desired. But it doesn't stop there. The idea of becoming from one equilibrium to another is not the way the world works. As I began to think of see all these different contexts around the world, it became increasingly obvious to me that the world, and markets in particular, were unstable, changing, dynamic, uncertain, and that was what we had to live with. So I then began to ask questions. Is marketing a management technology, a societal provisioning system, or the study of seller and buyer decision processes in increasingly complex contexts? Or should it be first of all thought of as a social science? And that thought began to surface that marketing was not about management. That what we really needed to do first of all was understand marketing as a social phenomenon, as to see it perhaps cast in the form of a social science. That if we were to do that, We might then be able to inform the practices of marketing in ways that would not otherwise easily be obvious. We might be able to inform the planning, inform the decision making, to understand better how consumer decisions function within different market settings, how businesses function in different market settings. And if we could do that, then we can begin to understand and interact more precisely with more feeling and insight into the marketplaces itself. And if we start to think about that, then it seems to me there are a number of issues that we need to consider. This began to open up, in the last few years particularly, a set of concerns that I worried about. In particular, it's obvious to me that there is growing fragmentation in the way business schools, the way universities treat marketing, not only collectively but individually. We find ourselves growing consumer behaviour theories, consumer culture theory. We find ourselves working with complex experimental designs. We find ourselves working in mathematical modelling. Each of these different areas and many others develop their own language and make it increasingly hard to understand exactly what we're talking about. It's hard to communicate often across the areas of marketing itself, and that's a worry. The growing fragmentation in marketing thought also means that it's increasingly vulnerable to related disciplines. And so I find in the University of New South Wales, the School of Law and Taxation is taking over franchising systems. That organisational behaviour is beginning to creep into all of the flexibility issues that marketing raises and look at marketing strategy. So strategic management is all about marketing strategy, or much of it is about marketing strategy. Economics are beginning to look at in terms of behavioural economics, and all of a sudden we find ourselves being somewhat threatened in a number of different ways, and that marketing itself might be under challenge. Then other issues began to emerge. How do you link the individual and the collective? How do you understand better the way individual behaviours somehow accumulate into structures and patterns? What happens? The key is often to be found in emergent structures. And then that introduced a whole new dimension, because that drew from complexity science. And to understand why it is, for example, that fish gather in shoals, birds fly in flocks, and manage to do so without any central governance, any central thinking, but they just do. Why? Could we be like that? Could that be the way that markets work? And in a sense, it partly is. Is equilibrium ever a realistic idea? The answer, I suspect, is no. Can we ever change just one thing? This is something we're often tempted to do, but somehow or other it often comes unstuck. And so changing just one thing becomes increasingly awkward. Can we combine the positive and the critical positions in marketing and macro marketing particularly? Activists are one end of the stick, and the positives scholars are another. Can we bring these together in some way? Is marketing just destined to fall apart? And that was the kind of worry that I began to accumulate. Each of those issues contributed to an inability to frame discipline-based responses. And the kind of things that I was then concerned about were the wicked problems that arose in Jean Laxniak's work, comments in macro marketing just recently. But they're the kind of things that all of us, in one way or another, begin to worry, could we do something that might contribute to this? Could we bring the power of marketing ideas to bear on resolving critical issues that communities, nationally and internationally, confront. The claims, I just had a few here. Recovery from environmental, social and economic catastrophe. I was thinking there of the Katrina hurricane that you probably remember, 2004, 5, something like that. But 6 or 7 years later, there was no recovery. It was still the people who were affected by that, the people whose homes were flooded, are still mired in a sea of bureaucratic waste. Can we do better? Could we have done better with respect to Aceh, the tsunami that washed ashore there, or Haiti, the earthquake that levelled the major town there? The aid agencies all rushed in, but there was a lack of coordination. There was a sense of everything happening in little bits. Adding it all up together was a problem. This was true for both Aceh and I suspect also for Haiti. So that was my first issue. Somehow or other, we needed to address how do we handle those sorts of situations which involve mass distribution to a population that is desperately in need. Helping migrant camps. I realised, I read a little later, this year, that the Dadaab migrant camp in Kenya is about to close. That's 330,000 people will in one go be dispossessed. They've been there sometimes 20 years from South Sudan. The camp itself had begun to generate, as human communities do, to generate trade and patterns of distribution, services, to generate an assortment of goods, services, experiences and ideas that could liven the camp, and indeed could translate it into a viable community. I wonder if that had ever been thought of. In fact, I realised a little bit later that Australia had done a little bit of that on a very small scale in an island in the Pacific called Nauru. And in the Nauru camp were about 1,200, 1,500 refugees, the boat people that had come to Australia. What we did was take down the walls and allow the refugees to absorb into the normal community. And gradually that's beginning to happen. I suspect it will gradually turn Nauru around, economically speaking, because of the wealth of knowledge, ideas. Many of these refugees are professional people. They come with collective insights. Could we possibly use marketing skills to address gun control? Could we possibly manage the prevalence of ice in some local communities in New South Wales, where I come from? It's become, in a few places, pivotal. Can we maximise or minimise the impact of disruptive technologies, the kind of things that Uber taxis and blockchain and so on might be part of? What happens when we marketise state services like education? And a good example of that, of course, is education, is the universities. Quite simply, the universities are becoming more and more dependent on raising their own money through fees. And as you move into a fee-based discipline, a more market-based approach to teaching, how do you cope with that? Is that the way to go? And if it is the way to go, do we have the ideas in marketing to reach out to that? The bottom of the pyramid population, reaching them in some way, framing ethical dilemmas in social marketing, something that Christine and I have been talking a little bit about over the last little while. And an odd one, locating value creation in multinational tax arrangements. Is that a marketing problem? It could be, because whenever you have a networked management, networked enterprises, somewhere there has to be a decision made as to where value is created amongst the enterprises that generate that network. What if a multinational with operations in many countries, how do you allocate value creation to the work of that multinational? So locating value creation within networks is something that will happen quite often and be increasingly important. And as I began to think a little longer about all this, I began to wonder what other disciplines might throw light on this. And that was when it became obvious to me that there were things like archaeology. I read some work of Monica Smith, an American archaeologist, who talked about everyday life in 3,000 years ago, in the archaeologists' reconstruction of their cities and towns. She was trying to understand better how everyday life was in those days, and to understand how whether trade was taking place, and if it was taking place, why. So we look back in history, and you can find in the archaeological reconstructions of local towns some critical areas. And then anthropology, it's obvious that since marketing is very much about everyday life, and it's dynamic and it's changing, and it happens everywhere, the anthropologists should have had a large bit to say about what their experience of everyday life in communities might be. There was one anthropologist in particular, a guy called Stephen Guterman in Minnesota, I think it is. But he looked at people in Panama and elsewhere and argued strongly that exchange was not simply about self-interest. He said people don't do it just because they want to be better off in some way. They do it, they engage in exchange because of the mutuality, the flows of ideas, feelings, insights that flow as people talk to each other, as people try to engage in exchange. Sociology, everyday social mechanisms, the bargaining that we undertake, these are all things that happen as we engage in our everyday life. Markets are not perfect after all. We've known that. Is inequality inevitable? Thomas Piketty's work on inequality in economic systems is such that he worries about that. Yet, in fact, what I'm trying to do, what I would suspect is the case, is that inequality is endemic in the way marketing systems work. It's not something that is an anomaly. It is something that happens all the time because marketing begins with everyone having different capabilities, being able to specialise in different areas, and that interaction that takes place allows trade to actually begin, where we can swap, barter, trade with each other, and that specialisation leads some people to success and some people to failure. So those issues are all important. Is sustainability ever possible? Can markets collapse? The answer is yes. It seems to me then that we needed to try and think about marketing from a different point of view, as a study of the behaviours, patterns and structures that form, grow and adapt in human communities, as individuals, household groups and entities engage in value-based market exchange within and between communities. I'm not sure that's a very good definition, but it was a working one that I began with anyway, to try and identify what marketing might be about if we were to conceive of it as a social science, not as a management skill, but as a social science. Basically, I was looking at the individuals, households and groups that engage in value-based market transaction. Value-based in the sense that it reflects self-interest, mutuality, exchange of social and economic values. Value-based market in the sense that it's voluntary, for the most part. That not only is it voluntary, It's often with strangers. So it's those sorts of attributes, the way what happens in those communities that form the basis for marketing studies itself. So that was where I have begun to centre my ideas rather more. If we were to try and treat marketing as a social science, then what? What might it look like? It occurred to me that it must be inclusive, that we have to take all the fragments that exist in contemporary marketing and integrate them, blend them together. Everything from consumer culture theory to social marketing to analytical thinking and models in marketing, all of those must somehow find a place and a relationship within a theoretical framework, if that is what we are going to try and do. It has to include all the things we've talked about, the hunter-gatherer communities as well as the high-tech cities. It has to include not just markets in the sense of what was called virtue, it has to include markets that sometimes form in the mafia, in drugs. And it has the in-betweens, where we have addictive elements such as alcohol, gambling, drink, drugs, and so on. All of those things happen. They take the same shapes, patterns as exist in conventional marketing. We must cope with those as well and understand better what the dynamics are that drive those particular situations as well. And we must look at it both at the individual and at the meso and the macro levels. We must cope with cooperation, coexistence, competition, and conflict. These at least are some of the elements that must be present and must be worked with in any theory of marketing itself. And it must include evolutionary change. As I've been stressing all the way, I really am convinced that marketing is not a stable, easily understood equilibrium type affair. It's something that is dynamic and will change constantly. Excuse me just a minute. And I think that these are important, useful starting points, that marketing could be a social science. But if it could be, then I began to wonder what kind of theoretical frame might be appropriate that would, as an example, that might perhaps meet these kinds of criteria. And so that's when I began to think of another issue, trying to understand what, for me at least, was what I've called the mechanisms, action systems, and structure theories, trying to understand just how it was that we might picture theory within as marketing as a social science. And the issue begins, I think, and I realise, and this has been talking to Christine and others over the last little while, the issue begins with this area called co-evolution. I've left these slides with Christine so that you can, I'm sure she'll get them to you. The area begins with co-evolution. People tend to respond to events in their world, their immediate world, in terms of sometimes they will change their values. More often they will change beliefs. They'll begin to see a wider range of possibilities. Sometimes their behaviours will change. And sometimes what we call social practices will change. These are the things that collectively we engage in, like drive on the left or drive on the right. This sort of social practice that minimises problems generally. That a catalyst will often occur in an environment. It might be a new product, it might be a new idea, it might simply be a perceived opportunity, But that starts the ball rolling. And we begin then to take action. If one takes action, and taking action might involve, for example, setting aside and starting to plan. It might be a company planning, it might be an organisation, an NGO, looking to work in terms of alleviating some social concerns. It might be an entrepreneur taking an action there, or in a social marketing context, it could be a fair trade response. The co-evolution could be in the nature of it being through a change agent that then has to take into account all these different bits and pieces. And the thing that is critical, I think two things are critical in this. One is, if we normally look at conventional marketing, you're thinking in terms of a marketing plan as a response to management and responding to some shift in the environment. That marketing plan is usually about the marketing system itself. It's about assortments, it's about the 4 Ps, product, price, etc. That marketing plan focuses on the operation of the marketing system. But to my mind, and to many marketers 50 years ago, what was really important was going to be the action field, was going to be the politics and the power, the way things actually worked, the way people put their heads together. Every action typically would precipitate reactions amongst other lobby groups, amongst other people who have interests in that particular area. And the result will be action fields interact with the marketing system and arise as a consequence of a planned intervention. And you must think about all these dimensions. But then you must also be aware no. Thanks. Okay. Then the other thing that I think is important is the notion of infrastructure. Sorry, my voice is getting a little wobbly. So what I mean by infrastructure is that in ordinary conventional marketing, people will make investments. They will invest in a shop, a retail space, in equipment, computers, whatever. They will also invest in brands, in creating more meaning in far as the market transactions are concerned. They will look at, and as a result of the transactions that take place, norms will begin to develop. There will settled patterns begin to emerge. But in particular, think in terms of tangible and intangible infrastructure that happens as the system proceeds. That then feeds back into each of these action fields, into the marketing system. Where you create a brand, that infrastructure feeds back into the co-evolution, the beliefs and structures that we have in fact there. And so this feedback mechanism, this simple model, becomes embedded within a dynamic framework that is of considerable, increasingly complexity. And it's that seems to me to be important. And indeed one could look at that more closely and begin to think in terms of all of the elements that make up these different boxes. So for example, social mechanisms, co-evolution of beliefs, behaviours and practices. And Christine has convinced me that I should add values to that. So values, beliefs, behaviours and practices. Other social mechanisms, the things that you rely on in the community and take for granted: diffusion, cooperation, exchange, self-organisation, emergence. Those are things that happen in every human community. We talk to each other, we cooperate, we trust, etc. I keep on shifting here, don't I? Then the action fields, this is the complex social mechanisms that result to link action fields and marketing systems, assortments, logics, locations, flows, roles. These are just some of the elements that make up each of these different areas. And as a result of the interactions, the infrastructure formation links back then to environment. It shapes the environment. It also, the immediate outcomes of the marketing system will shape the system itself and also the environment. My point here is simple, that the interactions that occur here are so complex and so important that it means we can't simply change one thing. You have got to think about the wide-ranging, about a system as a whole, and somehow understand in particular the interactions between power, between marketing systems or delivery networks, the infrastructures that are created, the way these feed back into the systems, the immediate environment, and in the wider environments in order to capture to the full and make sure that you're understanding what an intervention is actually going to do. That was the kind of thing that we finished up working towards. Just to try and, as a finish to this thing, I wondered about fast fashion and what would happen if we tried to introduce this kind of thinking into fast fashion. The idea that somehow or other, if we could change customer behaviour, we could make an impact on the Bangladeshi manufacturers who are perceived as treating their employees with gross disregard, underpaying them, etc. Is that possibility? Is the fact that fashion is speeding up, it's bringing impact back into the manufacturers because they're quite happy to introduce change regularly, every few weeks? Can we somehow shift that process or nudge that process in a way that might alleviate the problems in Bangladesh and many other developing countries, as well as sorting out the problems at the retail end? If we start to think about that, then it seems to me that for example, we have to look in terms not just at the customer, the retailer, and the media that are interacting here. This is the retail end of the system. But there are quite different marketing systems to be found in different parts of the structure. These will include the whole fashion specialists, the designers, and the retailer. This is a fashion design element, and that is a completely different culture, setting. It has different patterns of mental patterns, different conservatisms, different ways of thinking. That then interacts with this one. And then you have, internationally, some people like Li and Feng in Hong Kong and Singapore that facilitate the links between suppliers and the Bangladeshi or developing country manufacturers. That also is a completely different marketing system. And so we now find ourselves beginning to think, if we try to take a systems view, we've tried to think through how do you cope the overlap, the integration of these different systems, all with different mental views, different conceptualizations of the way the world works. Each, in a sense, rigid, because all of these systems are comprised of people who don't really want to change too much. And that's a problem. So we really now have to say to ourselves, it won't be enough to try and talk to some customers, say buy fashion less often. Somehow or other, we've got to nudge that whole complex system structure in a way that might be appropriate to what we're trying to do. And to catch the thing at the end, all the rejects in Bangladesh are then sold by the employees who are underpaid anyway, but they sell it on the used clothes market, and it's part of the way they make their household living. And equally, customers throw out clothing. We throw it out in bins called the Smith family. I guess you do the same kind of thing, and that also works through a used clothing marketing system. So there is, in a funny kind of way, at least 4 quite distinct marketing systems interacting with each other. We need to understand, if we are going to try and intervene in any one of these things, we somehow need to understand the interactions between these different structures, to understand the rigidities, the flexibilities, to understand the way these systems work, particularly where power and delivery systems interact with each other in each of these areas in order to nudge it in an appropriate way. It's that kind of collective insight that seems to me to be of real importance. So where does this whole thing about marketing as a social science take us? We can begin with people, in particular, everyday life. We can recognise that in everyday life, human communities trade with each other, that they develop thereby patterns which are emergent structures, increasingly complex, multi-level, dynamic. We can understand and explore the interactions between these different levels and adjacent and not so adjacent systems. It's always going to be a challenge to avoid over-complexity as well as under-complexity. Challenge to avoid trying to think too hard about everything, because we can never embrace all of this work. But we somehow need to understand the power dynamics, and I emphasise that word dynamic, that which these systems are going to exist. It's not a matter of moving from one equilibrium to another. It's a matter of understanding the forces that are driving change within the complex set of systems that we've chosen to study. In all of this, as we sit back, we're going to find ourselves, as we think about a marketing system, we're thinking about a focal system. And you need to somehow map that structure, the adjacent ones, and begin to see how far the boundaries have to be pushed in order to make it work successfully. So it's always a model building exercise. It's never finished. It's not as if we're ever going to not have to do this sort of thing. But it's the nature of marketing as a social science. And it seems to me that's where I'm beginning to, now after 50 years of this, I'm beginning to find myself getting to an end. That's where I think that's where I suspect marketing is going to be, at least as from my point of view. So, thank you very much.